and statistics that show the value of gender equity for better outcomes. And then I'm going to share insights from two of my research that show how gender equity can be operationalized to enable more sustainable practices and better outcomes for the agricultural sector. So it's not me saying this, it's UN facts. That research has shown that if women farmers had the same access to resources as men, global yields would increase to up to 30%. And this translates into 2.5 to 4% increase in total agricultural outputs in developing countries. And this single fact can potentially reduce the number of hungry people in the world by 12 to 17%. That's about 100 to 150 million people that we're talking about if women farmers had the same access to their male counterparts. That's one. The second one is that women are often the custodians of traditional seeds and indigenous knowledge. That's a fact. For example, in Africa, older women serve as valuable reservoirs of wisdom and leverage their inherited knowledge and expertise to contribute to biodiversity and food security. Indigenous women around the world lead in environmental conservation and utilize their ancestral knowledge and practices to build climate resilience. And so they preserve crop biodiversity and seed varieties, protect pollinators, and maintain intact forests. These are roles that women traditionally play in the food and agricultural sector. And so if their capacity is enhanced in this area, we will find out that it will lead to better outcomes. There is also evidence that countries with higher representation of women in parliament are more likely to set aside protected land areas and ratify multilateral environmental agreements. So, if this is the case, we need to call for more participation of women, even in politics, because we've seen it, and there is evidence that when women are in decision-making, on the decision-making table, it leads to more and better outcome for the environment and agriculture and climate change. And these all contribute to food security at the end of the day. In the business world, it's also interesting to know that gender diverse firms often excel in environmental reporting and climate governance compared to their peers that have that are male dominated. These are all UN facts. They are there. It's not my statistics. Okay. So lastly, we also know that women are more likely to invest in soil health and climate resilient crops. So these are all statistics, evidence proven. And I want to now specifically refer you to my work that has also looked at how this can be operationalized. So I have an article with the Law Development and the Law and Development Review, where I talks about advancing new governance models for gender data in climate resilience funding. And in that article, I argued that if we make use of gender data, if we collect the gender data, analyze gender data, and use then gender data to inform climate resilience funding, we're going to have more climate resilience and mitigation practices from women. And this is so currently, most funding on climate resilience are gender neutral. And so everybody, it looks like we're funding everybody, but in reality, less than 0.1% of those funds come to women or at least enhance both climate resilience and women's rights. So coming to women. And so in this, and I've told you the kind of roles that women play and can play in the sector. So if there are no targeted funding to promote these roles that women play, it wouldn't lead to good outcomes. And I'm saying that a way to do it is to look at gender data. If we use gender data to inform the way we fund climate resilience, then we are more likely to fund those activities that women are into and then get more results. The last one will be again on governance. So equity in agricultural resources. In my article on rethinking women's roles in pastoral governance, I try to call on more participation of women in the governance of agricultural resources because I saw from my findings were that if women were more involved, for example, in this case, it was a case study in Nigeria and West Africa. If women were more involved in governing agricultural resources, to land and water, it's going to mitigate conflicts. And presently, we have a lot of, very frequently, conflict between farmers and pastoralists on the use of this agricultural land and water. But if women were more involved in the governance, it will mitigate conflicts and lead to more food security because currently, because of the crisis and conflicts, it's leading to food insecurity because farmers can't go to farm anymore. Pastoral community can't even move around anymore in peace, and is affecting the availability and production of food and services. So I will stop here, and we can take it up further.
Thank you very much, Jane. That's a fantastic overview, and I almost want to delve into a debate on this alone. I many years ago used to be involved in editing and managing from the OECD development side the African Economic Outlook, obviously with the African Development Bank, and I'm saddened to hear that things have not moved on as much as I would have hoped in the last decade. But maybe that's for another time. I think we need to move on. So we have Professor Kababa here with us, Amos Kababa, and I'd like to know if you'd like to say a few words on this topic. So the question, in case you missed it, was how can fostering gender equity in agricultural research and policy development lead to more sustainable practices and better outcomes for the agricultural sector as a whole? Professor Kababa.
All right, thank you very much, and I hope you can all hear me loud and clear. And yeah, because I'm working with the University of Energy and Natural Resources, and sometimes you have student challenges, so that is why I'm late. The topic she has mentioned is a very important one, and the question is also very important. And I want to draw your attention to the fact that since the 1900s, there was let me call him one. He was more like an advocate for women. We call him Dr. James Kwakwe Agri. Those from Ghana will remember. And he mentioned something, even at that time, since 1900s thereabout, that he mentioned that when you educate a man, you educate one person. But when you translate, you educate a woman, you are educating a whole nation. So this empowers everything we do about trying to engage women in the whole agricultural chain. Let me try to give a simple example from Ghana, because at least from the northern part of Ghana, that you have a lot of women that are trying to transform their various households through agricultural work. You will find that the northern Ghana practices that the lands belong to the men because of the customs, but usually the plowing, the men will do that. But when you look at the rest of the value chain of the whole agriculture sector, that is sowing and checking the plants and ensuring that everything is fine, and even the harvesting and taking it to the market, it is the women that have to do that. So which means we have to make whatever effort it is to build the capacity of the woman and to ensure that at every level of the agriculture value chain, women are represented. Now, how do we go around this? In Ghana now, we talk about 24-hour economy. The new government is pushing for a 24-hour economy, which is all on agriculture. So, which means in the case of Ghana, we have to cleverly think about from the schools, how do we ensure that more and more women are educated on agriculture? And to do agriculture, you also need science. So it means the promotion of STEM with focus on agriculture also becomes very key. And I'm happy that this whole issue is telecast by the AAU, because this is extremely important. Because what we see in practice over the years in our tertiary institution is that we are seeing a lesser representation of women in the science-based courses, which I think is also a challenge which we need to address over time. Because it will be very interesting, like based from what my other colleague have said, to see that for the Minister of Agriculture, for example, it is a woman that is holding that position, because she will understand the pain it takes to put food on the table and the processes that comes along with that, and will take in informed decisions in trying to ensure that the whole value chain of agriculture is well kept and we are getting the necessary responses that we need to do in order to ensure that everything goes well. Let me end by saying that, you see, if you take Africa, if more homes have food on the table, I don't think we'll have all the conflicts that we are seeing. But the challenge we are seeing nowadays in the western part of Africa is that you will see that agricultural lands, fertile lands, are changing over hands to other vital economic sectors like mining. When we come to Ghana, this is a big issue, and it's not different if you go to Nigeria or some other countries that have some precious minerals. So, but because in most times the women representation in our parliament is also not up to date, the men will only think about, okay, let's get the money from the other sectors, and that is fine. Forgetting that the more you are destroying the lands, the more there is less and less vital land available in order to produce the necessary food and putting it on the table. It is at the end of the day increasing our cost of the agriculture sector. So you see that local foods which may be produced locally seem to be in one way or the other more expensive, because of course there are other factors that we can discuss along that. So then the government have to spend a lot of money trying to import more food rather than trying to what? Defray some of these costs in educating more women in the sector to innovate in this particular direction. So I think the bottom line is, the more we can educate women, especially at the lower level, to understand that science, technology, innovation, and all of that is towards the agriculture, I think the better we can improve the whole value chain for the agriculture sector in Africa.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
You make a really, really good point there. So kind of thinking ahead, planning ahead, and interesting girls more in STEM subjects would absolutely cause a complete sea change there. Thank you very much for that. And Professor Aberdina, I know that you have a few things to add, please.
Yeah, thank you. First one, so I want to talk from the perspective of a food scientist. I will also provide data. The FAO have estimated that closing the gender gap in access to agricultural resources could increase yields on women's farm by 20 to 30%. This is data from FAO. And if this is done, definitely it's going to boost overall agricultural output and strengthening food systems. Let me also say that, as Jane also mentioned, that women contribute significantly to food production, but they lack access to land, credit, and training. So I'm an advocate for gender equitable policies, which, if we're able to promote this, is going to empower women, leading to higher productivity, diversified incomes, and more resilient households, which will ultimately contribute to food and nutrition security, which is one of the SDGs and one of the challenges we are facing globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for introducing those facts and figures, because it really highlights the challenge really that kind of exists in gender in agriculture. And as much as I'd like to debate this one topic all day, we do have a few more questions. So I'm going to move quickly on to the next one. What measures can be taken to enhance transparency in data collection and sharing within the agricultural sector? And why is transparency so important? Professor Obadina, if you'd like to start us off.
Yeah, thank you. This is an interesting question as well. The question is into two parts, so I'm going to also respond in that way. So firstly, let me try to say some few things on the measures needed to enhance transparency in data collection and sharing within the agricultural sector. Number one is that there's need to develop what we call clear data governance frameworks. And how do we do this? By establishing policies that define who collects, who owns, who uses, and who shares the data that has been collected. Also, data ownership rights of farmers and stakeholders should be ensured. Okay? And number two, there's need to standardize data collection method. And how do we do this? By using uniform protocols for data gathering. For example, standardized of survey, metrics for yield, soil health, climate data, etc. This will ensure that data is comparable, reliable, and replicable across regions and institutions. Thirdly, I will also say that there's need for open data platforms and portals. This will definitely be achieved by creating government or regional platforms where validated agricultural data is made publicly available. This data can include weather patterns, pest outbreaks, crop yields, market prices, and policy updates, which are very important and useful for the stakeholders. Let me also mention this under the measure, which is capacity building and training. There is need to train the farmers, extension workers, and stakeholders on proper data collection and how to report the techniques used in the data collection. And on that as well, I will say, if you are able to do this, it will definitely improve the digital literacy and encourage participation in data sharing initiatives among the different stakeholders. Let me go to the second part of the question that talk about why is it that transparency is important in agricultural data collection and sharing. Number one, you also mentioned it when you are giving us the background information about this webinar. There's need to be trust across stakeholders, farmers, policymakers, investors, and consumers are more likely to engage and collaborate when they trust the data that is coming out. Number two, it will also inform better policy and decision making. Transparent, accurate data will ensure that policies are based on real evidence rather than assumption. This will also promote fair market practices. Once you have transparency in the data collection and sharing, this will make the market data prevent price manipulation and ensures farmers receive fair compensation. Lastly, on that, I will say that this will definitely encourage innovation. Open and transparent data will allow startups, researchers, and technology developers to create tailored solutions. Let me stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You've outlined that really well. So with that all in mind, then Dr. Moss, do you have anything to add, Alan?
Yeah, thank you. So here at the United States Department of Agriculture, we require data management plans. And a data management plan is a 1 to 2 page document that everyone that's undergoing a research project is required to create at the start of their project, as often part of like a proposal, if you are receiving money from us. So a data management plan is what we consider best practice. It's 1 to 2 pages, like I mentioned, and it describes a whole life cycle of data that will be collected and how it will eventually be like stored and reused. So that should start from like the very beginning, from when you're collecting the data, describing all those procedures and how it's going to be like safely stored. A data management plan does a lot of things. One, it gets everyone on board for how data is going to be like used, so it's like very transparent. Two, when it comes to like data security, a lot of researchers, like myself included, I'm a former entomologist and biologist before I started here. And when I was in grad school and as a researcher, like I didn't follow the best like data practices because I wasn't aware of them for a large part, and I had data losses at some points, and so it really does like help a lot of different stages. But then also, if you have a stakeholder that you're working with, you can share your data management plan with them so they can have full transparency in how the data is going to be like stored and used. And it's such a best practice that not only at U.S. Department of Agriculture, but actually most federal agencies within the United States government, if you're a researcher, you're required to have this data management plan. And it's just like a thing I really wish that like I'd known about back when I was like in academia, because this was definitely not like widely used when I was in academia. So this is something we're trying to push out to the full like scientific community to adopt this best practice.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it does, sound like that would effectively at least, stop or foresee any issues that might come about as a result of research or as a result of data collection. Moving to the next question, as we are running short on time, what actions can the agricultural sector take to better engage and include marginalised voices in research and decision-making processes? And I'd like to put that first of all to Professor Kabuba, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Just allow me to have some 30 seconds to also respond to the previous question. I think one of the biggest challenges for the agriculture sector is the fact that even when you take the agriculture sector, the institutions, the individuals, the researchers who are working in this sector are finding it difficult to even share information among themselves. This is it's a big issue. I don't know how we crack that, but it's a very difficult issue. Another difficult issue we find is that before you even go to collect that data, those standardized protocols that allows that when I pick my data, I'll be able to share with you and we all have the same understanding. These are also issues that differ from country to country. Now, as a result of that, I just want to mention within the group on Earth observations, which is called GEO, which is geared towards the provision of open access data used on various platforms to help with understanding all sectors, including agriculture. In fact, within that group, they have developed what we call the Geo Knowledge Hub. Now, this Geo Knowledge Hub is trying to give an open platform for national agencies. It means you can have a national, you can have it for a country. And the focus is, first of all, to even allow for those countries to share what I call algorithms that are, let me call it, federated or trusted in a way that will now inform even the type of let me call it, if it's agriculture yield, the kind of data that you even need to collect. And because this is an open platform, it allows all stakeholders, NGOs and government to interact with the platform, and they can decide what they need to do. Because the challenge with all of this is that usually the idea of co-creation at the beginning is always missing. And this is always one of the challenges that we face along the value chain. So I think this is something that we need to consider and see the way forward by which we could be able to do that. The last thing I just want to mention is that you will also see that a project comes, and during that project period, there is a platform, and after the project, it is done. So it means that all that knowledge that was done in creating such a thing is lost. So which means that there needs to be a mechanism. In fact, there has to be a national mechanism to ensure that in smaller countries like Africa, where it's very difficult, we need to find a mechanism by which there has to be a custodian institution that is able to link up the dots and ensure that is created over time. One thing we always don't talk about is that maintenance of the systems to keep this data accessible and transferable to the local community is still something missing. Because when we go to the farmers, we collect the data, we do our research. After that, the farmers have no clue about what we have even used, the analysis we have done. So the issue of blending with all our programs and projects, the issue of research uptake, when we go back to them and say, what, after we've collected this data, we've added some climate data, we've done some analysis, this is what your data is giving us. And acknowledging that farmer that have contributed his indigenous knowledge also become very important in showing the gratitude and in allowing for continuity anytime that we want to have that data back. I hope I have managed to address your question.
Yes, absolutely. So you've given some really, really good points there, that kind of acknowledging and introducing sort of transparency, education around it, would all be extremely helpful. Dr. Moss, do you have anything to add? Because I know that you've done quite a bit of research into this area.
Yeah, so one area that when we're working with marginalized populations in the US government is that we have a process called formal tribal consultations. So the indigenous populations in the United States are a little bit treated a little bit differently than they are maybe other parts of the world. So they're actually sovereign nations within America. So they have like sovereignty over their reservations where they live within America, but they're also considered to be US citizens. So they have kind of a unique status. So we actually have kind of like country to country communications with tribal nations in America. So we call them formal tribal consultations. I was helped lead and organize one that happened about almost exactly a year ago at this point, and it was on tribal data sovereignty. So the sovereign right for tribal nations to have control of their own data. Which is something that we haven't always respected in the past. And there's been instances, especially around like medical data and other information that's been inappropriately released from tribal nations, or the data has been like constantly reused over and over again. It was maybe collected for one purpose, and then it was used over and over again. And they're like, hey, wait a second, like this is our data. We had no idea that it was going to be like used in these other ways, and we didn't agree to this. So we recently had a formal tribal consultation where we talked through a lot of these like issues, and there are some like specific policies specific to America that were like of concerns of tribal nations, and these were all like brought up in a very high level. So it was like I wasn't allowed to like even talk during these negotiations is like very high level USDA leadership, and then the leadership of tribal nations. And it was a really great way for there to be like direct communication between the two. And from that, we produced a report, and we're also going to have like more future formal tribal consultations, including hopefully next month, about this to like really follow up. So like we're recognizing that one wasn't like enough, and that needs to be like a constant conversation about these issues, and platforms for people to express their opinions as well at high levels. Now you're on mute, Catherine. Catherine, you're on mute.
Yeah, I'm muted. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm very sorry. So, Professor Obadina, do you have any points to add around perhaps how we can better engage marginalized communities and rural communities in research and in decision-making processes?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, because the inclusion of marginalized voices is a big issue. Majorly we talk about women, we talk about youth, but what about the smallholder farmers and people with disability? So it's key to make agricultural research and decision that are more relevant and sustainable and impactful for this set of stakeholders. So there's need to involve this set of people, the marginalized group, as active partners, not just subjects in setting research priorities. So when we want to do setting up research priorities, so this set of people need to be involved. They should also be involved in co-designing of the project and evaluating the outcomes, not just using them as subjects. Secondly, there's also need to provide platforms where these groups of people can voice their opinions safely and meaningfully. Most of the time, they are not always considered. And lastly, I would say that there's need to address structural barriers with this set of people by tailoring capacity building programs like trainings, workshops, mentorship, so that it can meet the specific needs of these marginalized voices like women, youth, and underrepresented entrepreneurs. So this is what I want to contribute to that particular question in terms of actions the agricultural sector should take to better engage and include marginalized voices in research and decision-making processes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Ezerigwe, do you have anything to add to this question?
Yeah, thank you so much. And a lot has been said around the table on it. So, especially on the role the academics and the researchers can do and how they should do that. I just wanted to add that we as researchers should also think about strategies to use and disseminate our findings to the public, and in a format that the public can understand. So apart from finishing our research and publishing it in journals, it would be nice to engage the public on non-specialist platforms where, for example, like conversation, policy options, where they can read this and understand it in non-academic language, right? Because what that does is that it helps for so the civil society will be able to consume it, and it is their role to lead advocacy. But if they don't understand the findings and what the issues are, it may not be easy for them to jump in and take up this advocacy, because at the end of the day, it's not the role of the policymakers all the researchers to lead advocacy to bring or get to the marginalized people. It's usually the civil society that works with the marginalized people in grassroots areas. So when we give them what to work with and provide it and make it easy for them to deal with, the civil societies will lead this advocacy at both the local level and the global level. But then they will be able to work with the local groups to articulate their needs and perspectives. And then we take that bottom-top approach. And that's my addition. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. That is a really, really good point, because better science communication and advocacy obviously will then mean that that can be translated perhaps into action when people have a better understanding of what the issues are. So on to question 5 now. How can we ensure equitable access to data, new technologies, and advancements for all farmers, regardless of resources or location? So, how can we ensure equity, really? Alan, Dr. Moss, if you could kick us off with this.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. In the US government, we call access, or I guess I should go broader. Nationwide, worldwide, there's a open science movement that's been around for decades at this point, but it's a movement towards making science open and accessible to everybody, regardless of where you are. So within the context of the United States government, we have a really big principle of the United States government is something called public access. So we're not a government behind closed doors. We're a government that should be open to the people. So they have like transparency for how the government works. And in the context of science, public access is very similar to open science, where the research that is being funded by the United States government, along with the data and research results, should be made publicly accessible to the public. So like the traditional publishing model, whenever you publish like an academic article, often that goes behind like a paywall that can be very expensive, especially if you don't have a university library that is funding subscriptions to access the scientific literature and associated data. So there's a movement towards open access where researchers would pay fees to make their research freely available to everybody. Open access has some real issues because it can be very expensive to publish in an open access journal where your research is made accessible to everybody. So we use a principle called green open access with the US government. So with the US government, we have large institutional repositories of research articles. At US Department of Agriculture, we have something called PubAg. So that is where if you want to find free full text articles, that's where you can find it at US Department of Agriculture. And we actually require that all of our researchers make, within 1 year, make their research results, including publications and data, freely accessible in these repositories. We also have a repository for data called Ag Data Commons. So if you go to Ag Data Commons, you can find all the data sets associated with publications, or you can find links to other freely accessible repositories. So this is really the process that we see as anyone who's ever trying to find an article and had the frustration of it being behind a paywall. It's a real issue, and it's a much bigger issue if you work for a small business, or if you're just an independent person and you're trying to get these articles. They can be extremely, extremely expensive to access. So this doesn't solve all issues, of course, and scientific literature is often written at kind of a highly technical level, where it's really hard to understand unless you're a technical expert in the issue. So some other, especially in the medical fields, some journals are requiring what they call plain language summaries of research articles. So these are written scientific articles still have all the important information, but they're written at the level that your average person could read doesn't have a PhD. So that makes it a lot easier for people to understand. So if you get a disease or something and you want to find out more information about it, you can find the scientific literature and not have to go to school for years and years to understand like the technical terminology that's being used. So it's not common in the medical fields yet, but that's kind of where it exists. And I see that as maybe kind of a future direction for like all future research, is that like maybe every scientific publication will have this plain language summary that goes along with it so that people can understand it. Furthermore, there's public engagement as another way to make things accessible. So going out in front of people that are not just academics and talking to them about your research and trying to do so in a level that they can understand. Again, not like going into like the highly technical details with terminology that they might not understand. That's really important. I think a lot of like academics really stay kind of like in their little like cubicles or in their labs, and a lot of them don't have training when it comes to talking with the public. So that's like another area that we're like really trying to push. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to now move on to the last question because I'm aware that we're a little short on time now. If any of our audience members have any questions that they would like to put to the panel, then please put those in the chat, and we'll try and briefly answer those at the end. So for our final question, how do power dynamics impact the ethical use of data in agricultural research? And how can policymakers ensure that agricultural innovations benefit all stakeholders equitably? I'd like to ask Professor Garway, please, to start us off with this question.
Thank you so much for that question. As I see it, most of the answers to that question have already been answered. We talked a lot about the issue of power dynamics. So what I just want to add on to the issue of power dynamics is that we must understand that it is multi-layered. Even when we talk about policy making, it's also multi-layered. The smallest unit is the household. So we are talking about agriculture. So I want us to think holistically, to see that even at a household level, you can have power dynamics and you can have a policymaker who needs to be told what to do. So when we are talking about policymakers, we are not only talking about maybe the governments and so on. Let's begin at the household level. Let's even begin at the school level. If you go to schools, we advocate that everyone be taught agriculture in schools, particularly in the context of Africa, where agriculture is very important for us. But for you to effectively teach that agriculture, it means that the person with power, let's say the headmaster in this case, should be convinced that it is important to teach agriculture and to research on agriculture. That is not enough, that commitment. They need to show it by allocating resources, allocating time, allocating staff. So I'm just trying to say, when we want to address this problem, let's look at it holistically or from outside the box, because what happens at home, what happens at school, what happens at work shapes what happens in a nation. So talking about research, maybe we can also at the national level talk about research agendas. And we all know that for you to do research, I talked about resources. We are always looking for funders, and the people who are funding us have their own agendas. Some people come from countries where they are not allowed to do research on animals. They come to us in Africa because we allow research on animals, including even humans. And they come and do it, but we don't know their agenda. So all those things are very important. And also, maybe to add more to the issue of the vulnerable groups, particularly in research, I really want to talk about myself and connect this answer to the earlier question on gender. I have never worried about gender myself. There I was in the field. We were told that the ox-drawn plows that are used are supposed to be used by men because they are heavy. So there I was. I didn't consider myself as a girl or anything. I was using those ox-drawn heavy machinery. I was using everything. And I was thinking, things are good. But here I am now. A year ago, I couldn't even walk. And now I was told the wall of my spine has been affected because the equipment that I was using was not tailor-made for women. So I'm speaking to research and innovation. And these are things that people don't even, bother about, but they have long-term effects on people. And I want to believe that there are many women beyond me who have been affected by the decisions that are made by the lack of research and innovation in critical areas, and are concentrating on agendas from people who have their own agenda. So I will have a lot to talk about this, but I know we are running behind time, so I will end here.
Thank you. And that's a really, really very powerful point, that, if, let's say, those conducting the researchers are pretty much of a similar demographic, then how can that research necessarily benefit or fit everybody? How can the outcomes benefit or fit everybody? I'd like to go to Professor Ezirigwe now. Do you have any points to add on this? How do power dynamics impact the ethical use of data in agricultural research?
Yeah, thank you. I'm sure when I made my intervention earlier, I had tried to unpack how the power play happens in that sector a lot. I just want to add that from my discussions and the discussions around the table, we already know that corporations are becoming too powerful, in fact, more powerful than states themselves. And so even when we want to negotiate governance or governance frameworks to govern this agricultural data, they are more powerful, and they help frame what the issues are. They help frame who comes to the table and those sort of things. So we should be mindful of that, or rather we are already mindful of that. But I want to point us to startups in Africa, in this case, startups that work in the food and agricultural sector, that we should also be mindful of them, because there is also some kind of power dynamics between them and the people they serve. They are nearer to the grassroots. They are the ones serving smallholder farmers presently. So we should be mindful of them and how that plays out in that space. But more importantly, we should try to recognize the fact that there are also inroads to Africa by the corporations. So the corporations will eventually watch this space, look at the startups that are doing well, and try to acquire them, giving them access to these smallholder farmers. So we should think about the kind of power dynamics that are playing out in that space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and a very, very good point. I think some of the issues there can be also funding and how funders go about effectively putting out the funding with perhaps not as much thought to longevity of that funding. So unfortunately, I was running a network with Global Open Data for Agriculture and Nutrition of different stakeholders in the agricultural data space for a number of years. And one of the problems that came up over and over again were these startups that would develop incredible products that could be really, really useful to farmers on the ground in the fields. And yet there was not necessarily any longevity of that product, which made farmers, as a result, rather suspicious of taking on and learning new technologies, new products that might just disappear a year or two later, or maybe less. So yeah, that you've brought up some really, really good points. Thank you, Jane. Could I now ask Professor Kabova if you have anything to add on this? How can we ensure equitable access to data, new technologies? Oh, sorry, no, excuse me, I've gone back a question. So how do power dynamics impact the ethical use of data in agricultural research? And how can policymakers ensure that agricultural innovation benefits all stakeholders? Professor Kabova.
Thank you very much. I think this is a very, very important question, and I was more or less nodding my head hearing from my dear colleagues, because first of all, it's an important question, and second, it's a sensitive question, because it's a very difficult one. And today, since I want to zero onto the fact that to do all of this, every country in Africa must recognize that to do research, to have data that inform anything that has to do with your local food nutrition, you must put budget on it. I think in Africa, this is where we have been lacking, because you see, if any donor comes, the donor will help you to a stage, but the donor will not be looking at everything in your ecosystem. For example, in Ghana, we love fufu. Fufu is our local food, you know. I don't think a foreign researcher will come and say, okay, let us try to see how we can innovate and ensure that women can be able to use a specific. It has to be us. There's an urgent need, for example, the government of Ghana to rise up and say that we must prioritize on the research, on the data gaps, and ensure that we produce the tools that our women can effectively use without all the issues of the health hazards that they have to go through. We must start to think like that, because without that, the challenge we will forever face is that there is always hunger. We will not be able to solve the hunger issue. And African Union Declaration, that is the Malabo Declaration of 2014, says we want to accelerate. And one of the ways by which we want to really look at the agriculture sector is to look at the aspect of women play a critical role and the youth playing a critical role. I want to link the two because of lack of time. If you take agriculture today, a lot of our youth are running away from the agriculture because the tools and practices over time are, let me call it, not modern. So they will prefer for a some color job than to take a hoe and trying to dig and what have you, which means research and innovation must come in to make the agriculture sector first romantic for our youth to know that, okay, you can get some smart tools and you can be able to grow something. So, but this again comes back to the fact that our governments in Africa must realize that we must begin to own this space and put in the necessary budgets that ensure that if a startup company starts, their work don't just end there. The government must find a mechanism which comes from the policy to scale up these startups over time, in ensuring that at the end of the day, we are owning these processes, whatever is done, and at the end, we are able to also leverage a lot of our indigenous approaches that we are, over time, we are missing. So I think by this, we can be able to put in some measures in order to move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kabova. Professor Obadina, do you have any more suggestions to make on how power dynamics can impact the ethical use of data in agricultural research, but perhaps more importantly, how policymakers can ensure that agricultural innovation benefit all stakeholders?
Yeah, thank you. I do, but I also want to link it to the question before this that talk about how can we ensure equitable access to data, new technology and advancement for all farmers. Number one is that I want to say that there's need to develop low-cost, scalable technologies. Professor Amos have also mentioned that, but I just want to be specific in some that we need now in Africa within the continent. Number one, we need to invest in simple, user-friendly tools that the farmers, smallholder farmers can enjoy and make them also to say that it's good to go into agriculture. And our youth can also be encouraged to go into agriculture. Example is mobile-based advisory services, solar-powered irrigation, drought-resistant seed varieties. All these, we encourage these stakeholders to go into the profession of farming, agriculture. Number two, we need to localize how we translate data. There's need to provide data, any type of data, either market prices, either nutrition data, either climate data, in local languages and dialects. The smallholder farmers cannot access the output of scientists' research. They cannot go to the library. They cannot read journals. They need all this information in the local language dialect. Lastly, I want to also say that we should be able to create what I call farmer innovation hubs. Farmer innovation hubs. This can be set up within the community-based centers where farmers can access technology demonstrations and also be exposed to training. And this will also encourage farmer-to-farmer knowledge exchange in these hubs. The farmer can go to the hubs, see themselves, exchange ideas, okay? And also they know that that hub is a place where they can get more knowledge based on whatsoever that they are doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have seen some fantastic questions that we have here in the chat. I'm going to read them out so that we can just kind of consider them in our own time, but I am aware that it's the end of the webinar and I don't want to keep everybody behind. But we have one here from Margaret. Okay, how exactly do we get governments to begin to act responsibly so that we're not always backbenchers when it comes to issues of development? And that's a really, really powerful question. I hope that that sort of final intervention there about how governments can come in, answers go some way to answer that question. And how do we combat security and terrorist activities on the farm? Yeah, so we'll throw those out there, but that might be for another event at this point now. I'd like to say a huge thank you to our panelists who are here with us today. The debate's been really, really interesting, and I kind of wish we had another hour or so, but I know that I did say that we would finish at 12:30 UTC. So we've discussed the challenges of things like informed consent and privacy, the issues of power and dominance that create intrinsic inequalities, finding it difficult to access and share data between researchers, and certainly at farm level, the issues that mean that farmers working the land who need this information don't always have access to it. So that could be issues of access to technologies, for example, or even issues that go as far as data illiteracy or even basic illiteracy, not being able to actually access the technology, even if you had access to the technology, which can be a real issue. But also How do we then engage marginalised population? Our panellists have talked about education, training, consultation, to bring them on board with the journey to help to combat the issues of suspicions around research and around sort of agricultural data collection, scientific communications, kind of advocacy, which would really help in understanding the outcomes of research, which unfortunately are inaccessible to a lot of people for various reasons, being it a lack of understanding of the content or of the technical language, or even just having basic access to it, because a lot of this information, as I think we've seen with Professor Erizigwe posting this wonderful information in the chat, unfortunately, a lot of that is behind paywalls, and we don't have the basic access to it. So we have also talked about issues around gender. So 30% increase in yields. Professor Erizigwe has pointed out, if women had the same level of access to information and the same access to education as men. And there have been some fantastic suggestions around how we can combat that, including more women in politics, but also the fantastic point that this would all create better outcomes in terms of environment and also food security as a result of that. There's been so many points. I've filled pages and pages and pages. I'd just like to say a massive thank you to our panelists. This conversation obviously will be made available on AAU TV and on the Ethical Data Initiative website. So it will be there for you to rewatch. And I'm sure that there'll be a lot more audience that will get involved through those mediums as well. I would like to also thank our Ethical Data Discussion Series team. Particular thanks to Agyemang Okiere and Tracy Aziafor, who've been doing all of the behind the scenes work for us today. And Larry Adams, who is also very involved in organising these webinars. I'd like to thank Felicia and Emmanuel for their work on the promotional materials, and also to Professor Frederick Armar, who is Director of Research at the Association of African Universities, and Professor Juliette Tondlana, who is the Director of the Europe Regional Office of the AAU and UNESCO Chair in Education in International Development. I'd like to thank them both for their help and support and input to this series. And of course, to our audience, thank you for being here with us today. And I look forward to the next edition. We will be in touch with follow-up information. Thank you, panel. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.